Welcome to Think Different Nation, a Steve Jobs playbook, the podcast that reveals how we perceive, collect, and connect the dots of creation. Your host is Ty Glover, ideation coach and consultant. Inspired by Steve Jobs' belief that to create truly innovative ideas, or rather to connect his proverbial dots, you have to trust in something. Your gut, destiny, life, karma, or whatever. He'll explore how these forces shape the most groundbreaking ideas. Ready to challenge your thought patterns? Let's dive in.
Beautiful, beautiful. I have to tell you, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you. I've read especially the Daemon, I think like at least 10 times.
What? Wow.
I do a lot of exercising. I do a lot of walking. That's my primary space. And when I walk, I smoke some weed, and then I listen to different books. And that's been a real space for me. To give you a brief idea of kind of where I was coming from with respect to wanting to talk to you was, I've been working with a very special concept for me, and it's what I believe is the process of creativity, of how we collect our ideas and how we create new ideas based on the information we've gathered. And all of this comes off of Steve Jobs' quote that he delivered back in Stanford University in 2005 at a commencement address, where he spoke about you can't connect the dots by looking forward. You can only connect them by looking backwards. So you have to trust that they'll somehow connect in your future. Now, listening to that and understanding, kind of grabbing and rolling with that for many years, I started to recognize also, the esoteric beliefs, the esoteric wisdom of Hermeticism and the second law of correspondence. Nothing comes from nothing. And in understanding that, I recognize also the fact that all of our ideas, the raw materials for our ideas, have to come from our experiences. Aristotle spoke of that. All of our information that we have comes from our sensory inputs. And so therefore, that whole concept of the raw materials for our ideas, just like the hamburger or the cheeseburger, you can't make the cheeseburger without the bun, the meat, the cheese. You can't make the idea without understanding of A, understanding of B, understanding of C. Therefore, we're putting them together to create a new output, that mental alchemy or the process of mental alchemy. Where I was really fascinated about, obviously, I think you may be getting there now with regards to your book, especially the Daemon, was the influence that the Daemon has over us, over who we are as far as individuals are concerned, determining whether, in fact, listening to some of your stories about Joan of Arc, for example, or Churchill, determining or assisting us in our course, what we are destined to create, to end up with as an end result. So the first part, I wanted to kind of get an idea from you as to how you collected these particular individual dots that helped you to arrive at the solution, the Daemon, the paying the ferryman, or what was the...
Cheating the ferryman.
Cheating, I'm sorry, cheating the ferryman concept. So can you give me a little bit of background about your experiences?
Yeah, it's rather extraordinary in that I believe that my own Daemon has been guiding me to writing these books ever since I was a child. And a series of curious incidents led me to believe that that was the case. I'll give an example, is that way back in probably 1994 or 95, I should know the exact year, it was 1995.
Okay.
And I'd gone on vacation to a tiny Greek island called Symi, which I'd been to many, many times before. I'd been going since the mid-1970s. And unusually I was on my own. My wife didn't come with me, and I decided I just needed some time for reading and everything else. And I took with me the book, The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. Okay. Now, one of the things I never do is dog-ear pages. I never turn pages over because it really, really irritates me, because I love books and I don't like damaging books. So anyway, many years later, I'm doing research for my first book. And I started to be fascinated by mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that's carried through the female line, that's contained in all cells, but it's very much carried through the female line. And I thought to myself, which of all the writers that I've read books on is likely to have anything on mitochondrial DNA? And I thought the only person is going to be Richard Dawkins. Now, I have all of Richard Dawkins' books. So I went to my bookcase, and because I'm in my library, I can actually show you this. That's my copy of The Blind Watchmaker. So I took it out of my bookcase, and it was the original version that I'd had with me on the island of Simi 10 years before. Okay. So I take the book out and I notice something curious. You probably can't see it, but there is one page that my earlier self dog-eared as I put the book down. As soon as I opened the book, I knew what this signified. So I opened the book and I read down, and halfway down the page is a reference to mitochondria. So I then checked on the book and I looked at all the other Richard Dawkins books, and it's the only Richard Dawkins book that references mitochondria of all of his books. Well, I argue that that again is my daemon giving me evidence of its existence and saying that I've been guiding you all the time for you to write this book, because the amount of extraordinary synchronicities, what I call synchrondipities, that took place in the research and the writing of the first book absolutely convinced me that in some way or other, I already knew about this book, or a part of me knew about this book. And in previous lives, for some other reason, I didn't write the book. Whereas this time round, it was quite determined I would carry through. And your point you were saying before, you know, it is indeed fascinating how much evidence there is of the library wizard, the library angel people. When they cite, they find the right book at the right time. And this happened time and time and time again. And sometimes I got to the point I was going, I don't even know where I'm going with this. Because when I started writing the first book, I started the book having no idea where I was going to go with it.
Yeah.
You know, it was just, you know, I decided I wanted to write a book, but I didn't know what I was going to write about. And suddenly, exactly 12 months later, I had a completed book with a whole new hypothesis about the nature of reality. So yeah, the daemon guides me all the time, you know, and I'm sensitive to this, and a lot of my friends are sensitive to it as well. And I'm delighted to see that somebody like you, you know, you're using these ideas, because by background, I'm a management consultant.
Okay. Likewise.
You know, so you and I both have a degree of synergy there, in the sense that I have long believed that the whole concept of the Daemon Eidolon dyad can be applied to management training.
Right.
Because if we can find ways by which a person who's in business can attune into demonic consciousness and use that to guide themselves in making business decisions, you know, we've got something very, very powerful. So, you know, it's something, you know, subsequently we can talk about this as to how you're doing this as a consultant, because I'm now retired, but, you know, the principles still apply, that somehow there is something that tells us and guides us. It's instinctive, isn't it? You know, it suddenly just spontaneously appears in your consciousness, and you even find yourself saying words that are not yours.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, I mean, that's such a powerful point. Being in Europe, you're a little bit more distant. So how do I even phrase this expression? But we're very much so a Christian-based country here in the U.S., and where it seems like we're moving further towards or in that direction with that religious base that we have. But how do you describe, therefore, the concept of the Daemon in relationship to the former concept or our understanding as it relates to the demon itself? And for anyone who may be listening to this conversation and hearing that word demon and having the automatic response of the negative, of something that should be avoided, how do you respond to that and explain that in such a way where
totally I mean, it's a classic example of literal demonization, in that the original concept daemon, D-E-A-M-O-N or D-A-I-M-O-N, is from ancient Greek. And the ancient Greeks believed that every human being at the moment of birth was given what was called a tutelary spirit. That is a spirit that guides you. And that spirit that guides you was the Greek term of the daemon. Socrates had a daemon, and the daemon was with him for all his life. And in fact, people who wrote about Socrates used to say that he used to have conversations with him. They'd be walking in the streets of Athens, and Socrates would stop and start talking to somebody that nobody else could see. Now, this daemon, as the ancient Greeks, particularly the pre-Socratics, believed that this other version of yourself is a version of you that knows everything that's going to happen in your life. And it does this, and it uses this knowledge to guide you. And Socrates, you may be aware, was condemned to death by the Athenian government for, quote, corrupting the youth of Athens. And he was put to death by drinking hemlock. Now, it is interesting that according to the records, Socrates' daemon ceased communicating when he knew he was going to die. It was as if the daemon was aware of the fact he was going to die. So this concept of the daemon goes right back into ancient times, but it's not only just found within European culture, within Greek culture. It is found in virtually every single culture around the globe. And this is what intrigued me, was that the daemon is the equivalent within the Huna tradition of the Hawaiian Islands. And as you know, the Hawaiian Islands are one of the most isolated communities in the world, yet they independently developed exactly the same concept as the ancient Greeks' concept of the daemon. Now, the word then, when the Christians came in power, everything that was to do with the ancient Greek belief systems, the Roman systems and the ancient Greek systems, was obviously considered to be heretical. And the word daemon literally was demonized, and the word daemon was changed to demon. But there is no similarity between the concept of the Judeo-Christian idea of a demon and the daemon, and they are completely different ideas. And I did debate massively when I wrote the book in 2008 whether I would call it something different. But I felt that in order to make the link historically, I had to continue using that term. Now, you mentioned earlier on about your interest in esoteric traditions. Now, effectively, the daemon concept carried through into a particular schismatic Christian sect called the Gnostics. And the Gnostics carried through this whole idea of the daemon. And interestingly enough, they also brought forward from ancient times the opposite system, which is called the eidolon. Now, the eidolon is our everyday selves. The eidolon is you and I. We are two eidolons now. And an eidolon lives one life and lives it only once. And it is guided by the daemon through its life. And I use the equivalent of, it's like a third-person virtual reality computer game. Now, imagine a scenario that you are in. I use the example, because of my age, of Lara Croft.
Okay.
Now, when you start a computer game, in a computer game where you have a tasks to do, you switch on the machine, and the hard drive of the computer loads a virtual reality, doesn't it, on the screen, using digital information. And that virtual reality can be perceived these days with modern technology in a three-dimensional way using a VR headset. So when you start the game, your on-screen character, the being on screen that you interface with the on-screen environment, your avatar, for want of a better term, is created at the start of the game. Now, I argue that the game player is a daemon, and the on-screen avatar is an eidolon. Okay. And what happens is the eidolon is effectively guided through the first time you play the game by the game player, isn't it? And what happens is you start the game, and with Lara Croft, you don't know where you are. You're in some kind of mysterious environment. You take Lara down a corridor, and she goes into a room, and there's a monster in there, and she's killed. That Lara Croft eidolon is now dead. never to live again. But the daemon continues, remembering what happened last time it played the game. So it starts the game again and creates another eidolon or avatar. And then it knows to not go in that room because there's a monster. Now, I believe that this is what's happening in life. What happens is we all have, at birth, we are given this daemon, which is our game player. And when we live our first life, the daemon and the eidolon are effectively one singular unit because it's the first life, what we call the virgin life. And the daemon and the eidolon just live the life happily, and they go around and they have disasters and accidents. And then at the end of that life, when the eidolon dies, the game starts again. But this time the daemon suddenly realizes its independence of the eidolon, and it's a game player. And it realizes, my God, I know things now that's going to happen to that on-screen creature that it doesn't know. But depending upon how the doors of perception are open, neurologically, depends on how effectively the daemon can communicate with its eidolon. Okay? So in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, have you read that one at all? Have you?
I have that one. I have not read that one
Okay.
to where I understand it completely.
Okay, to understand how the principle works, we have to roll back to the end of the first life, the end of the virgin life. Because what happens at the end of a person's life is they have a near-death experience. You know, the records, my new book is about near-death experiences, and I've written extensively about near-death experiences for many years. Now, what people say is when you have a near-death experience, there's things called moody traits. And these are a series of traits put together by Raymond Moody to describe what a near-death experience is. And we all know them. You know, there's the slowing down of time, there's the meeting of entities and everything else. But there are two sections of the near-death experience that really fascinate me. Well, there's three really. There's the time slowing down.
Right.
Okay. Then there is what's called a panoramic life review. Okay, and in the panoramic life review, it's people say, don't they, my life flashed before my eyes. Okay. And the next one is when people feel they meet something called a being of light. Okay. People turn around and say that when I died or got near death, there was an entity, there was something there waiting for me, something there that was going to guide me, something that was going to take me through the panoramic life review. Now, if you apply my hypothesis to this, I can explain all three of those specifically and what their purposes are. Okay. The panoramic life review doesn't, when it takes place in a near-death experience, it's literally fast-forwarded. You know, people say, I saw my life flash before my eyes. That is because when the dying process starts, the daemon and the eidolon, as I say, become two personalities. And the daemon realizes that it's independent of the eidolon. And it realizes that it's something it has to do. It has to create a new sequence of life. It has to create a new program, effectively, a new game. But what the daemon doesn't realize is when somebody has a near-death experience, all the near-death experiences we've got, people have survived death. They've come back to tell us. And what means is the daemon literally realizes that the eidolon's going to survive. So what does it do? It starts the recording of the life, the new game, and then realizes the person's not going to die. So it literally presses the fast forward to get through that life. Okay. So the person who should have died doesn't, sees this life run in front of their eyes. Okay. And they're back and they're going to survive, but ultimately they do die.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when in a real, and I call that's a near-death experience. In a real death experience, the split takes place, the daemon and the eidolon split. The eidolon dies. The daemon then is able to create a new game. And I even do the science of where the records of that game is created, where it's located, how the brain downloads this information. I literally do it to the nth degree from the neurochemistry upwards. So what happens is modern science is coming to the conclusion that the universe And its basic point is information. It's data. It's information. And that information field, the human brain processes that information field to create this external reality. In other words, it downloads the information and projects it outwards as if it's a virtual reality scenario. This principle is tied in with something called a holographic universe, and the idea that the universe is holographic in nature. So if the universe is holographic in nature and is built up by information, this would explain a lot of the mysteries of quantum mechanics. It would explain, for instance, how the seeming solid world around us is 99.999999996 empty space. And all that is solid in what we think is a solid universe are quarks and electrons. Everything else is made up of quarks. So, and quarks themselves are what's called point particles, which means they have no extension in space. So everything that we think is physically here doesn't exist in the way we believe it is. The only reason you don't fall through that chair and I don't fall through this chair is something called electrostatic repulsion, which is the fact that within each atom, at the edge of each atom, is electrons whizzing round in the outer shell. Okay, each electron is negatively charged, as are the electrons in your backside or in your legs. So therefore, when the atoms of your body come in contact with the atoms of the chair, what's happening is a negative charge and a negative charge are reacting together. And you know from schoolboy maths or school lessons, like a magnet, they repulse. So when people think that they're physically touching things, they never touch anything. So the reason we have a feeling of solidity is because of the electromagnetic fields. There is no physical solidity anywhere. Now, which means then that everything's made of information. What's it doing? Now, I argue what it's doing is the brain is creating this illusionary reality, and we're all co-creating it. And the model works like this. Remember I said that you're living in this virtual reality game, and at the end of that game, you have another life and another life and another. It's like Groundhog Day. The Russian language edition of my first book was called Groundhog Life, for that very principle. So literally you live your life many, many times. And within the program, there is literally a scenario for every outcome of every decision you can make in your life, just as it is in a computer game, isn't it? It's already encoded in there. So you make Lara Croft go down a corridor. The corridor is then rendered in order to accommodate the decisions you as the game player make. This is what happens in life. So you can now imagine a scenario that we've had this conversation many, many times. You know, you decided to communicate with me in a previous life. You might have done it 5 years ago, 10 years ago in the future. And every outcome of every decision is already there. It's already in what's called
everything, everywhere, all at once.
It is, exactly. And this is one of the things that I discussed, that a lot of the ideas and principles I'm putting forward are already in the zeitgeist. They are already known by people subliminally. And that's why there's more and more movies coming out about this stuff. I do find it extraordinary that the world is not beating its way to my door going, this guy's already done the science. I mean, for instance, Danny Rubin, who was the guy that wrote Groundhog Day. He was the script writer. Well, he wasn't the script writer. He's the guy that came up with the idea and wrote it and sent it into Hollywood. When he came across my first book, as you did, he gave copies of that book to all his friends at Harvard, because he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. That was in 2007, 2006. So clearly the ideas are there. People just know they're true. And the point we were making earlier, that theology have known about them. Also, esoteric groups. I mean, there are various esoteric groups that have contacted me over the years and told me I've been doing the science, that the things they've been teaching for years. The Servants of the Light, for example. I know from Masonic friends that this is central to Masonic beliefs. We know from earlier on it's central to virtually every single religion. And earlier on, I mentioned the Gnostics. Gnostics have the concept of the daemon and the eidolon. But it's not just the Gnostics. Within the inner traditions here of all the religions, within Islam, you have the concept of the Sufis. The Sufis have exactly the same idea. The idea that there's a shard of God inside all of us, which is the daemon. Then you have the concepts in Vedanta, which is again exactly the same. Then you have the concept in the Kabbalah. They're all the same thing. I mean, within the Kabbalah, there's a concept called the Or Ein Sof, which is the inner something. Now, I then argue in my new book, I then say, but it's more interesting than that. So there's eidolons that live their life once. Then there's the daemon that guides us through the life. Now, at that point, I do the science, and the science is rock solid up to that point. I don't have time to go into it, but if we need to, I can go into the science in great depth, from the neurology, as I said, everything else. So you have those two. But then I argue that above the daemon, there's something I call the uber-daemon. Okay. And the uber-daemon is the equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. Okay. It is the information field of all humanity, maybe all sentient beings. Okay, and it's a singular consciousness. And this explains, I'm sorry?
Is it transcendent of time, meaning connected to all things having lived before and will live in the future?
Correct. Then I wrote a book after the Daemon. My third book was called The Labyrinth of Time, which I discussed time and how the Daemon Eidolon dyad fits in with our knowledge of the psychology of time perception, the physics of time perception, and the philosophy of time perception, and it works. Okay, so this collective unconscious, the Jungian collective unconscious, or what I call the Uberdaemon, is the field of information that people, when they do hypnotic regression, go into. You know, when people regressed hypnotically back into past lives, they come back with information they couldn't possibly have, which people use as information that that we reincarnate, that we've been other people in past lives. I don't argue that. I disagree with that. I say, no, you're confusing it. What is taking place here is you only live your life again and again. You don't live multiple other lives of other people. What's happening is your eidolonic consciousness is attuning in to the greater Uberdaemon consciousness, which means that when you go into that state, or when you're hypnotized, you pick up information rather like a radio tuning into different channels. And you'll attune into the channel of a 17th century French peasant, and you'll live their life. You'll see their lives. It's not you. It's attuning into a greater you that contains all that information. And then I argue above that.
How would you align that with past life regression?
I'm sorry?
How would you align it with past life regression? Then?
That's exactly what
the connection with other people's experience?
Yes, no, exactly. No. What it does is, just to explain it again, there is the one consciousness that experiences one life. That's the eidolon. Then there's the daemon that experiences all variations of your life.
Okay.
Then above that is something, as I say, I call the uberdaemon. And the uberdaemon is an entity, for want of a singular consciousness, that contains all of the life memories of everybody that's ever existed.
Interesting.
Okay, it's like Bill Hicks, the American comedian, once had a very famous monologue where he said, breaking news, young man on acid realizes that matter is just energy going at a walking pace, and we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. That is what is taking place. We are one singular consciousness that's individuated into individuated daemons and then into individuated eidolons. So when somebody hypnotically regresses, and I work with hypnotic regressionists, by the way, you know, I'm not just saying this, I have associates who do this for a living, and they say the only theory that works for the things they've witnessed is my ideas, my hypothesis. So what happens is, when you're in a hypnotic state, it is known that people are very malleable. They're very willing to come up with information that they think the hypnotist wants. A kind of person who gets easily hypnotized is the kind of person who is that type of individual in the first place. So when you are asked to regress back into a past life by the regressionist, what happens is your consciousness bypasses the daemon and goes into the uber daemon's memory fields. And literally, it will arbitrarily pick a piece of information out of that. As I said, like tuning into a radio station. You pick one radio station, and the radio station you pick, for example, is a 17th century French peasant. And suddenly you have all these memories of being this French peasant living a life in France, and you bring back information that proves that you really were that person. What you've actually done is attuned into that person's life, but that person is not you. It's not evidence that you have been that person, because at a higher level of consciousness, you are everybody anyway. Okay. So at a high level of consciousness, you can attune into anything, but you have to train yourself. And this is why esoteric traditions train people to get into the Daemon state, so they can see what's happened in all their past lives and get all that knowledge. But they can go higher and get the knowledge of the collective unconscious and bring that back. Now, I then argue that behind that is then something I call the Daemon. And the Daemon is literally God. And it is the backdrop of everything. I'm very interested in a concept called pandeism and panpsychism. The idea that everything is conscious, but everything is also God embodied in us. Alan Watts, the British philosopher in the 1960s, had a very similar idea to this. He didn't do the science like I do. Watts just said, it seems that we are all, and Watts' argument was a really good one. He said, imagine you're God, and you are just everything, and you are immortal. Mm-hmm. You're going to be very bored. So what do? You create your own soap opera, and you embody yourself in that soap opera and forget who you are. In ancient Greek terms, there's something called amnesis. Okay. And amnesis is when you die, all the past life memories are wiped. Okay? And this is what I argue takes place with human beings when they die, that they come back, but they don't remember, but the daemon does. But the idea with the God embodied within everybody is that God himself has forgotten who he is. In order to be effective, he doesn't need to know who he is. And again, I wrote a biography of the American science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. And Philip K. Dick wrote a novel called The Divine Invasions. And in The Divine Invasions, it has a young boy called Manny. And Manny is God, who's forgotten he's God, and he's living within this scenario. But but again, the Gnostics believe we are all part of God. The Sufis believe the same thing. As I said, the mystical tradition find the God within. So you go within to find without. But I literally think I am the only writer in the world that's doing the science of this, that's saying, okay, these are interesting ideas, but how does the science work? How does this work in one way or another? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think about it. You had mentioned the data. You had mentioned it's all about data, information. And I think about the way you conceptualize the Bohemian IMAX and the way it's a holographic image, and how I've seen it within esoteric tradition. It's about being able to even take, if you were able to identify your own specific space within that hologram and grab that specific space that is there for you, the me itself, but then you're able to see everything within the eye. So it goes into mentalism. All is, within the mind, and the mind is within all. But what I thought was really even more fascinating was about Richard Burke. I think it was Consciousness, where he spoke about the first cells and how the first cell before there was an effect impacting the cell, and therefore the cell recognizing the cause. There was nothing until there was eligibility of growth, which means a particular cell had the ability to detect the cause, and therefore there was the effect. The effect was a precept. It was the building of the basal ganglia, because continuous effects over millions of years created what he referred to as a precept, which is the recognition of that effect, and thus prompting further development of the brain until you're getting to the point where the brain has to figure out what to do with that information and creates it to a concept. And what he referred to it as being like a composite photography, where you're taking all these different snapshots of images, and then finally you're getting enough to conceptualize an understanding. And that was his understanding of the definition of the development of intelligence from the first cells. So I'm seeing the parallels across the board with what you're speaking of, with what is spoken about within the Hermeticism itself and the various laws. And it's just fascinating the way when you fly by at a more aggregate level, you can see the things that you wouldn't be able to see if you're living so deeply within the trees itself or your own specific discipline or area of study.
I think it's true. I call it silo science. You know, the idea that, and it's not through any plan or anything. It's just that people specialize very early on, and they specialize very precisely. I've got a number of friends who have PhDs and they know nothing outside of their area. Whereas in esoteric traditions and in medieval times, you had polymaths who like Da Vinci, who, you know, picked up information from everywhere and pulled it together. And it's only through doing that that you're going to see the full picture. You have to have an understanding of so many different areas. You know, people have turned around to you and said, what qualifies you to come up with these things? Well, nothing, except the fact that I'm an eclectic thinker and I take information from everywhere. You know, if I'd have ended up doing my PhD, which I was planning to do many, many years ago, I could have become an expert in the Italian Renaissance artist Piero della Francesca.
Micro.
But I'd have been microed, yeah. I'd have been focused in on everything. Whereas what I've done is, and because I'm fortunate in that I have a very peculiar memory, I tend to, if I've read something, I tend to remember it in detail. So, you know, I will recall something I read in 1966 and I'll see the page in front of me and I'll read down and suddenly I'll go, that's what links to that. Yeah. And because I'm a very eclectic thinker, I'm interested in everything from quantum mechanics to mathematics to neurology, to psychology, to sociology. All of these areas are all areas that interest me, and esoteric beliefs. So I'm not saying I'm in a unique position, because that would be vain, but I am in the fortunate position that I can read something and go, do you know what? There's been a paper written on microbiology that deals with this. And I'm then in the position I can actually sometimes contact the microbiologist. Like there's a guy I met many years ago called Professor John Joe McFadden, who's doing fascinating work with quantum mechanics regarding biological systems. And some of his work is incredible, but he's not talking to the people who are doing the neurology.
Of course not. No, that's not how that works.
No, and then they all will fight their own positions. Right. And I'll sit with neurologists and I'll say, are you aware? Like, for instance, you know, the fascinating work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff, you know, something called orchestrated objective reduction, which is the idea that reality is generated from quantum mechanic effects, and consciousness is generated from quantum mechanic effects within the microtubules within the neurons. Now, that guys are doing that lot. But my new book, for instance, the foreword for the new book has been written by Dr. Pascal Michael. Okay. And Pascal is one of the leading young neuroscientists who's working with dimethyltryptamine, and how dimethyltryptamine works within the brain, and how people, when they take dimethyltryptamine, go to another reality, which is more real than this one, and they meet entities there. Yeah. You know, it's, but you know, sort of Hamerhoff are not talking to people like Pascal. Whereas I'm in the position that I'm overlooking both of them and saying, well, I'll take a bit of that and I'll put it together.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, and I think you're referring to Jeremy Narby as well.
Narby, the Cosmic Serpent. Narby's work is extraordinary. Yeah. Narby's work influenced me quite a lot, particularly his idea of the concept of the serpents, yeah, and the symbolism of the serpents and DNA. Yeah. You know, the coil and the way the serpents work. And I met Narby once at an event, and we swapped some ideas. And his work is really good, as is a guy called Benny Shannon, who's an Israeli psychiatrist or psychologist, and he wrote a book called The Antipodes of the Mind. And that again is about his experiences with DMT. It's similar to Narby. But you see, this is not my skill, my strength, I don't know. But I know the work of Narby. I've read Narby, I've read Pinchbeck. I know Pinchbeck, I've interviewed Daniel Pinchbeck. So I know what is happening. And in the field now, because people are coming to me, I've got academics now coming to me with the information they've got. Like, for example, and this is extraordinary, there's been work done at the University of Sussex, around about 20, 30 miles from where I am now. And they've been working with psilocybin, magic mushrooms. Now, the idea is that they think, you know, when somebody has psilocybin, takes magic mushrooms, they start to hallucinate. They start to see other realities. And the basic neurological theory on that is that it breaks down, the brain starts to confabulate. It starts to create information that isn't there. So what they were expecting to see within the brain was that when magic mushrooms are taken, and what they did was they had somebody take magic mushrooms and then they tied them up with an fMRI scanner, you know, three-dimensional scanners of the brain, so they know what's happening in the brain when the drug takes place. They were expecting to see that parts of the brain would link up in different ways immediately to create the hallucinations. Much to their astonishment, they found it switches the brain off. It stops the brain being able to communicate with other parts of the brain, which is proof of what Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, C.D. Broad, and Aldous Huxley argued. The brain is an attenuator. The brain is there to take information out. The brain is there to stop us seeing the greater reality that's out there, the holographic nature of the universe. And when we take psilocybin, when we take dimethyltryptamine and everything else, the brain's ability to do that is compromised. And in doing so, we suddenly, your doors of perception are opened up to alternate realities that coexist with this one. Now, again, some of the work that's been done in other areas as well. There was something else that was discovered recently. That's right. Yeah, in my new book, I cite this. An extraordinary event took place 2 or 3 years ago in Germany, where an elderly guy fell off a ladder and he damaged himself. And he was in hospital, and they had him in a scanning machine to test whether he'd had brain damage because of the injury. While he was under the fMRI scan, he died. So for the first time, they actually had a scan of the human brain at the point of death. Everything that they found supports my hypothesis. Absolutely everything. What happens is the brain quietens down, and then suddenly the brain starts communicating in a completely different way. And I argue that what the brain is actually doing is, you know, that we believe that it's the neurons of the brain that communicate information across the brain and help the brain function and creates consciousness. However, there's a great mystery here, because only 10% of the brain is neurons. 90% of the brain are what's called glial cells. Glial is Latin for glue. It means effectively the neurologists believe that the glial cells were there to hold the neurons in place. They've now discovered the brain communicates non-locally, not chemically. You know, the way we have neurotransmitters through the synapses communicate or not communicate certain messages across the brain. The certain neurotransmitters been released, like melatonin and serotonin and dopamine and everything else. But it's not quick enough for how the brain works. There's something called a binding problem within the brain, which is when, say, for instance, I see a red bouncing ball bouncing down the street. I see simultaneity of a red bouncing ball, but the red is being processed in one part of the brain, the bouncing is being processed in another, and the other visual system is being processed somewhere else. It cannot happen that way. They're too far apart in the brain. However, if the brain communicates non-locally using the glial cells, this is why we get this feeling of simultaneity. This is how we can solve the binding problem. But it also means that the brain then, if it's working non-locally, it's working under quantum physics things, whereby one subatomic particle does something and another subatomic particle immediately reacts, which means there's instantaneous communication. But if there's instantaneous communication between the elements of the brain, there could be instantaneous communication with the rest of the universe, also instantaneously. And this is where the information is downloaded. And I argue the information is downloaded from something called the 0-point field, the quantum vacuum. And the quantum vacuum, basically, we believe that the vacuum of space is empty. It's not, it's full. It's not a vacuum, it's a plenum. And it's called the quantum sea. And it's just full of information. And it's this information that we, our brains, download to create this external reality that we perceive is real. But that's not solipsism. It doesn't mean that we are all individuated. As I said, at a higher level, we are one thing. We're like waves on an ocean. But you and I are both co-creating this. Do you know in quantum mechanics there's a term called collapsing the wave function? Okay. So until a subatomic particle is measured or observed, it's in a quantum state where statistically it could be anywhere in the universe. The act of measurement or observation makes the statistical wave, which is a probability wave, collapse from being smeared out into being a point location. And then when it becomes a point location, it becomes a physical object in the terminology of quantum mechanics, which is still 99.xx empty space. But we are doing this all the time. We are collapsing the wave function of our reality. And when you and I interface like this, we create what I call an egregore, whereby we are co-creating the reality we are sharing. And everybody else we observe around us are all co-creating this huge data field, which we share. And again, it makes sense.
Most definitely.
You know, I'm bouncing up and down to the world going, hey, world, I'm here. Look, will you just listen to me? And if I'm wrong, I don't care. If a scientist comes along and says, you've misunderstood quantum mechanics, you've misunderstood the neurological concepts, great, I don't mind. But they don't. They just ignore me. They just pretend I'm not there.
There's a great documentary on Amazon Prime. It's called The Dalai Lama Scientist. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
Fascinating, because it takes the Dalai Lama. He's taken to a location and he meets with various scientists across different disciplines, across psychology, across cosmology, astronomy, quantum physics, and he speaks, and he literally takes his group of Buddhists and they meet together on a regular basis to come up with their theories, the Buddhist theory on certain topics versus the scientific theory, and the amount of alignment that exists across the disciplines, such as quantum physics. Both have the concept of an object doesn't exist independent of the observer. But all that comes again from Hermetic beliefs, I believe, with all is in the mind. You have to conceive it in order for it to exist. And I use that analogy of if you have something in a box and you put it in that box and you walk away from it for years, you will never think of that perhaps object again until you see the box and then you bring that object into existence again. It has ceased to exist as an object itself. But just to tie this back to something else you had mentioned earlier about looking above at a macro level and noticing the connections that are existing within the smaller the details. There's a lot of study going on about creativity and the creativity crisis. I've seen reports about that for at least the last 10 years. But my argument against that would be about the fact that we're so insular, we're so focused on the influencers nowadays, and therefore following the patterns that the influencers tell us will lead us towards success. And we take that pattern and then we build upon that pattern, thus taking us away from creativity and from individualism and towards more so the homogenized way of creation itself. And that's one of the reasons why I would argue strongly the fact that the way we're consuming information by not observing, questioning, understanding, and then making deductions about that information, we're lazy thinkers. We're not even thinking anymore. We're grabbing information you can see from the politics of today, grabbing it, consuming it, making it ours without even applying logic and understanding to what we're seeing. And therefore it becomes ours. And we're abdicating the responsibility that I think we have as humans to think, to adapt, to adjust our situation to what will come in the future. So I'd love to get your thoughts on.
Hi, that is such an important point. And I think you've just astonished me. That is so true. You're quite right. I'd not seen it that way before, but we're actually, the information, we're not seeking the information. We're being given the information. We're being funneled the information by people who we think know better than we do. But what is really happening here is a lot of them are snake oil salesmen.
We're following
those to make a quick buck.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we know this I mean, a lot of my friends are involved in the training in the world of out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, these kind of things. And, you know, as you know, you probably don't, but I wrote a book on out-of-body experiences a few years ago. And I find that people get corrupted. They might go into it with a genuine interest in understanding and training people how to do it, but they realize that there's so much money can be made that they move away from doing objective research and selling a commodity. And that's something I've tried so hard not to do. And people have said to me over the years, they've said, Tony, you could go out there, you could make yourself a billionaire by going out there and just selling your ideas and your products, commoditizing them. Now, as we were saying earlier on, we're both management consultants by background and you by what you do. And we know that you can do that. But it's morally questionable because you're not actually helping anybody. You're focusing in on it, something to make money out of it, rather than saying, looking up in wonderment and going, wow, this is just extraordinary. And there's a group of friends of mine at the moment. We are working together on this because we want to smash this commoditization of altered states of consciousness. We're fed up with the can I use the word bull S's?
It is, most definitely.
Bullshitters, you know, and there are so many of them there. You know, for instance, I've done the last 2 years, I've done an event called Contact in the Desert in Southern California. And I really love it. It's really brilliant. But that is a classic example of how there are two strains here pulling against each other. There's the people who want to understand, and there's the people who want to make money. And unfortunately, the people who want to make money are the people that the press and the mass media like, because they're easy to knock, they're easy to criticize, and they're easy to ridicule. So they have them on the TV programs, they have them on the Netflix series, because they're easy to knock. Whereas my associates, we're doing the real deal. We are not easy to knock. I mean, for instance, one of my friends is a guy called Graham Nichols. And Graham Nichols trains people in out-of-body experiences. Graham is the real deal. You know, he's fascinated by his own experiences and he wants to understand them. He wants to know why he's able to perceive information when he's not in his body and where he is, how, like the $1 million question, you know, when you're in an out-of-body state, how are you perceiving anything? Because you don't have eyes, you don't have ears, but you're perceiving. So there is another form of information being given there. But the snake oil salesman never discussed that, you know, whereas Graham is fascinated by this. So we need to pull away from that. But as long as people like you and I and a lot of my associates are denied platform because we are dangerous, because we are, I did an event in New York, 2008, something like that, had 300 people in the Roosevelt Hotel, Madison Avenue. And I did my speech, and in the middle of the speech, this guy stands up in the audience and says, I think you're a bullshitter. I think you're a con merchant. He said, I don't believe you understand quantum mechanics at all. I said, I think that you are somebody who has a very good memory, but you don't really know. So I'm going to compromise you now. I'm going to take you off your script. I want you to explain to me Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in front of all these good people. So I did. And then I said, do you want Pauli's exclusion principle while you're at it? And he said, no. And he was a physicist from Princeton. And I said to him, well, am I right? And he said, yes. And I said, can we talk afterwards, please? He ran away. He didn't want to engage with me.
Of course not. You're challenging a concept. You know, I had a conversation with a gentleman who's this person is a Jewish gentleman, but yet he's spoken about his political views, and actually he's mentioned standing on stage before with neo-Nazis speaking because they have a very similar argument or a very similar style as far as their politics are concerned. And I was thinking the fact that when you find yourself standing on stage with a neo-Nazi as a Jew, that should be your sign, the fact that you're on the wrong side of history. And the fascinating thing about him is I said that if I could tell you what you believe is wrong in such a way that you understood and agreed with everything that I said, could you change your position? And he said, no, I couldn't, because we are so bound by the history that we've created, and therefore it becomes our story. And you can't walk away from your story if you spent 40 or 50 or 60 years building that story. What else do you have? So you're stuck.
Whereas people like you and I would believe from chatting to you now, we are, you know, there's an old phrase I use, but it's very true. It's always all good to have an open mind once your brains don't fall out. But I think to a certain extent, having an open mind and an eclectic way of thinking and applying rigid logic to everything you encounter, which is what I do. To me, logic is everything. If I'm saying something that does not make logical sense, it doesn't make logical sense. And however much I want to believe it, it's wrong. And there is right and wrong. Yeah. And, you know, I think the world is becoming more and more believing things that make no logical sense because it makes people feel comfortable. And it explains, you know, like the proliferation of conspiracy theories. It's because people are desperate to want somebody in control, even if it's the bad guys, even if it's them. Whereas the reality is there's nobody in control and it's chaos. And we're all in this mess. But by turning on each other doesn't help, you know. And it's interesting times. Interesting in raised commas because I think it's dangerous times.
You have to wait around to see what's going to happen next.
Oh God, yeah. It scares the life out of me as to what it's as if we are living as again using the thing. It's like we're living in a Philip K. Dick world. Mm-hmm. And everything that you as a child and growing up used to hypothesize what the future would be like. We're living it now, but it's a dystopia. We're living in dystopian times where there are crazed people who are in power, who I don't know what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Well, and you mentioned Philip K. Dick, and he was the writer of, I believe, the dystopian, even what was the HBO or the Amazon TV show?
Oh, the Man in the High Castle.
The Man in the High Castle, yeah, about the alternative reality if Germany and Japan had won.
I know, and again, it's a fascinating. If you read the book, it's intriguing. And again, I have a section in my book on Philip K. Dick on the Man in the High Castle before the TV series came out, because some of the things that happen there, you know, the idea of parallel timelines, you know, within quantum mechanics, there's no reason why you can't have parallel timelines. There's no reason in quantum mechanics where you cannot have subatomic particles going backwards in time. And I'm not talking about things like tachyons, which are theoretical. I'm talking about, there's a guy called John Kramer who has a thing called the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics. And this is fascinating. It's the idea that, again, you have different types of waves. You have retarded waves and advanced waves. And I never get this right, which is right, but one are going backwards in time and one are going forwards in time. And what happens is that there are waves going backwards in time and waves going forwards in time, and they interact at the present moment. And when they interact at the present moment, they create an interference pattern, as in holography. You know, the idea that an interference pattern is what holographics work. So the present moment is moving through time, being stimulated by objects going backwards and forwards in time. So suddenly then the idea of when we talk about the present moment, and it's a game I know that children play, the idea of how long is a moment, to say that we live in the instant. But what is an instant? Philosophers have argued this for years. And one of the points I've made is how unreal our life is, because the past has gone, so doesn't exist. The future is yet to be, so doesn't exist. So we exist in the nexus point of two things that don't exist. And then you think, wow. And you go, well, what is taking place here? And as St. Augustine said, when he said about time, he said, time is one of those things that if I don't think about it, I understand it. But as soon as I start to think about it, I don't understand it at all. And again, that's what I found after 380 pages of writing a book on time. I had no more idea of what time was. But we know from Einstein that time and space are just elements of the same thing. So suddenly, space-time is something that's extraordinary. Time expands and matter actually constricts. There's something called the Lorentz contraction as you go towards the speed of light, where matter itself, just in space, pulls into itself. And you're going, the universe is just extraordinarily weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you've got people who just don't realize we know so little. Again, going back to the ancient Greeks, was it Plato or Aristotle that said, the more I know, the less I know.
Yeah.
And that's what I've discovered. The more I learn, the more I realize I have no idea. Whereas we have the concept of Dunning-Kruger, which is all over the internet these days. You know the concept of Dunning-Kruger?
No.
Okay, Dunning-Kruger was put together by two guys called Dunning and Kruger. Always a surprise. That always amazes me that they can find the things named after them. But Dunning-Kruger is the idea that the less knowledgeable you are, the less aware of the fact that you don't know things.
Of course, yeah.
So the idea is somebody who knows very little thinks they know everything. And that's the problem we've got now, is that the Dunning-Kruger people are taking over, where they think they know, where they don't understand even basics. And the argument is that because they don't understand mathematical concepts, because they don't understand geometry, the flat earthers, for instance, that they don't understand basic principles of science, they believe they're right.
Yeah. And
a little bit of knowledge, you then realize, well, no, it's like that at all. It's far more mysterious, and we need, it's difficult. I don't believe, I'm from a fairly academic background, but my academic training has only trained me effectively to be able to evaluate facts and figures and evaluate whether something is true or not.
Yeah.
If you don't have that rigorous academic training, you don't have that structure to be able to do that. And I find it impossible to argue with. I can argue with people when they have a modicum of knowledge, but dealing with people who have no knowledge at all, you can't win, because where do you start?
It's best not to. I'm learning more and more. It's best not to.
So with you're out training in industry, doing this kind of work then.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I work in management consulting by trade itself, and this is something that I've been working with. This space, my program, Creative Juices, is something I've been working with for the last 4 or 5 years, but it's been a long journey, and I've had to take each step of that journey because the Daemon, to that point, has been giving me the information along the way to help me to figure out the bigger conceptual picture. And a year ago, I would not have been able to speak to you today and to understand the concepts that you're speaking of in relationship to my understanding of how things work. So it's been a long journey for me, but now I'm out now teaching the process. Everything operates according to a process, and including the process of creativity. And so the influence of your books and of people like Mitch Horowitz, Gary Latch,
Oh, Mitch, yeah,
and
yeah,
some of the other folks out there, and these incredible concepts and understandings have helped me to to fill in the hologram. So that now I have that better understanding of things. I even work with cannabis, for example, and work by a gentleman who works with neurolinguistics programming.
yeah.
Okay?
Powerful stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. So my concept is kind of like a combination of neurolinguistics programming, which explains the mechanical aspects of how we experience, but it's also the spiritual aspects of how we experience and understand through concepts of esotericism, through hermeticism primarily, and the seven laws that structure the reality in which we perceive within.
Do you know, many years ago, I was very keen on bringing together the principles of NLP together with my Damon Eidolon dyad,
Yeah,
because there's so much synergy there.
right, right.
And one of my associates was very high level NLP practitioner, and some of the things he showed me were just extraordinary.
Yeah.
You know, it was almost as near magic
Yeah,
as anything I'd ever seen. You know, and the way he was able to manipulate people's thoughts was
right.
incredible.
Well, see, now think about that and think about now that's internal. That looks inward at our inter and intrapersonal relationships that we have with ourselves and with others. Now, what I work with is what I call neural creative programming, which doesn't look at the internal stimuli. It looks at the external stimuli of all the experiences that we have when we capture the different understandings of the forms that we see playing out around us, the functions, the processes, and the questions that we ask of those things like Rudyard Kipling's Serving Men, Keep Six Honest Serving Men, who asked all the questions of the whys, the whats, the wheres, the whens, from which we're able to formulate understandings that build upon greater and greater understandings. So mine kind of looks at an outward view. It doesn't look inward like NLP does. It looks outward at all the other external stimuli and how they influence our understandings of our experience.
You've really got something, haven't you? That's really good.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think for me, at least it perfectly describes the process of how we take in the raw materials for our ideas, are challenged by them to create solutions to solve those challenges.
Yeah, no, I'm with you totally on that, you know, and I think that as I've said many, many times, you know, I had toyed with the idea of taking the Daemon Eidolon dyad and turning it into a management training program. And I still think it would work. And my esoteric friends, you know, were saying, well, you know, this is what we train effectively. And it's a matter really of packaging it and making it saleable, really. I mean, because I've done management training for many years, but in terms of my consultancy work, I was compensation and benefits.
Right. Okay.
Slightly different, but I'd also done employee relations as well. But the softer areas of management development were always something that really intrigued me as to how you could use, because we know, don't we, there's certain management tropes, you know, there's certain things that come up and they're massively popular for a few years, you know, like total quality management and Kanban and all these other ideas that are milling around. But the softer elements of how you develop managers, I mean, I'm also a trained psychometrician. So I was applying psychometrics to team building, this type of thing. And I'd always thought, this is quite an interesting idea.
Yeah.
I'd always thought, would it be fascinating if you could, and I know the techniques where you can do this, whereby you can switch off the eidolon in the brain by the special kinds of glasses you can wear that actually take out your periphery vision on either side. And a guy called Schaefer, who is a psychiatrist in New York, had developed this work whereby he was able to deaden the dominant hemisphere of the brain to work with his clients. Now, I was thinking, imagine a scenario where you do that, where you deaden the dominant hemisphere and you allow the non-dominant hemisphere to come forward, which was where I believe the daemon is located. And in doing so, you then give them a psychometric test. So what you do is you do a psychometric test with the eidolon, then a psychometric test with the daemon, and then you bring the two together and you get a whole model of that person's thinking. Now, again, I know that from associates of mine in neurology, I know that, for instance, sodium amytal put into the carotid artery will deaden, it's called the WADA, WADA test, where you can deaden for about 10 minutes the dominant hemisphere. And they do this with people who are suffering from intractable temporal lobe epilepsy, for instance. And one of my associates, she had this test done, and she was saying to me, she felt her personality disappear as the sodium amytal hit. And she said, suddenly, from the depths of my knowledge, this other being came up that was much greater than me, that knew far more than I do. And then I felt it fade away again as the sodium amytal came. And then again, I would argue that's the Daemon. You know, and the Daemon normally, because we know from split brain operations, you know, Michael Gazzaniga and Sperry, Roger Sperry, we know that when you cut the corpus callosum of the brain and you end up with two hemispheres, you end up with two personalities.
Okay.
You know, and this is powerful. And we know that, for instance, there's something called alien hand syndrome, where people who've had a stroke where the dominant hemisphere has lost control, the non-dominant hemisphere becomes more in control than it normally is. And as you know, the non-dominant hemisphere, which is normally the right side of the brain, works the left side of the body. And people, when they've had this, women will be going to get dressed in the morning to go to work, and they will be wanting to pick one set of clothes, and the left hand will come and fight with them and pick other clothes. And I'll give one final example of this, if you don't know it. One of the people who'd had the corpus callosum cut with Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry was a young lad called PS.
Yes.
And they were talking to him about what he wanted to do when he grew up. He was about 14 or 15. And he'd had his corpus callosum cut. And when the non-dominant hemisphere is non-verbal usually, because the Broca's area and Venika's area, where the verbal words are in the dominant hemisphere. But they can communicate, and they communicate sometimes using Scrabble cards. Okay. So what happened was they asked this young lad what he wanted to be, and he verbalized and said he wanted to be a quantity surveyor. As he did that, his left hand grabbed the Scrabble cards and wrote out automobile racer.
I read that part in your book. Yeah.
And isn't that extraordinary? So it means, as Roger Sperry said, it means that there is part of us that's been continually overruled because it doesn't have control of the body.
So now let me follow that point, because you also talk about how the race car driver and how the driver was able to detect the accident far around the turn, slow down. And the question was whether the Daemon had noticed the crowd sitting in the side that turned towards it. But where I was going with this question is this a question of, was that person, in theory, based on his creation and his existence, destined to be a race car driver, but did not follow what it was destined to do?
Yeah.
What's your thought around our destiny versus our fate?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, because if the Daemon, well, I think the Daemon is in a position that it wants to follow all the adventures it possibly can. So this time round, it will follow you on it'll make you go on a certain path. It will guide you. As I said earlier on in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I have what I call the Huxleyan spectrum, which is how open the doors are depending upon the neurological correlates of your brain as to whether the Daemon can communicate either by hunches, through dreams, or verbally. And if your doors of perception are wide open, you then acquire schizophrenia, where your messages are coming in from everywhere and you're totally confused. But the Daemon can guide you through, and it might think, well, this time round, I want to take Ty to Australia and see what happens. And as soon as it does that, it doesn't know what the future is either, does it? Because it only has the memories of up to the point where you didn't change last time. So in other words, you've lived a life in one way, but if you live the life again, the Daemon can only remember the incidents that happened in previous lives. But if it sends you off on a tangent, it's suddenly new again. And I argue this is why deja vu drops off as you get older. It's a known fact that deja vu, the incidents of deja vu, very powerful when you're younger, get less and less, and then kick off again just about when you're old. And of course, the argument is that if you are making decisions and taking different paths all the time, there'll be a point where you'll take a path you've never taken before. And when you do that, you can't have deja vu because you've never done it before. So again, works, you know. So the Daemon could decide this time round, I'll go to, or I'll become a racing driver, or I'll do this. I also argue that I believe that there are certain individuals in this world who have lived the perfect life. They have followed what Connors does in Groundhog Day. He actually lives that day over and over and over again. Thousands of times, Danny Rubin told me he planned it to be in the original scenario. And when they live the perfect life, it's like living the perfect game. You know, you complete the game and you get to the end and you complete all the tasks. So what are you going to do? Well, I argue that certain people choose to come back into this life that have lived it many times before to help others. And again, this is a theme that is used in a play by a guy called J.B. Priestley. And I wrote a book on J.B. Priestley a few years ago. And J.B. Priestley wrote a play called I Have Been Here Before. And the central character is a guy called Dr. Gortler. And he comes back into this reality to help a young couple not make a terrible mistake they made last time. And it's a fascinating play. He's much maligned, J.B. Priestley. They don't realize he was so far ahead of the field. People think he's old-fashioned, whereas in fact he was the opposite. So a long answer to a short question. Yes, I believe that we will fulfill every possible outcome of everything we can possibly do.
Within our repeated journeys, or within the one journey or the repeated?
Repeated journeys. There's again, I keep bouncing off. There's a guy called Jorge Borges, who was an Argentinian writer, and he wrote an amazing story called The Garden of the Forking Paths. Okay. And that's exactly what he's talking about, is that our life is like a load of paths through a wood. Yeah. And it just depends which path our daemon takes us on that we explore. But the paths all exist.
Gotcha.
They're all there. It's just we need to collapse the wave function of that particular path or the other path. And again, as a final point, the last paper that Stephen Hawking wrote before he died with a guy called Thomas Hertog of CERN, and they wrote a paper which they called the top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics. And they argued that at the first instant of the Big Bang, every outcome of every single decision made by every subatomic particle is already encoded in. And the universe that you follow is the universe that follows that path. But there are trillions and trillions and trillions of other paths, all waiting to be collapsed.
Always change your path.
Pardon?
You can always change your individual path.
You can. At any time. We make decisions all the time, don't we? And sometimes the decisions, like Fangio, you know, the racing driver you mentioned. I have other examples in my books, as you know, in the Daemon, of people that have made instantaneous decisions that have changed their lives. But there'll be another version of them that didn't do that, but did something else. And I also argue that the Daemon works for the long game. So when people turn around and say, oh, my life is really bad at the moment and it's terrible, the Daemon is positioning you. It means you have to go through this to get there. If it went that way, it wouldn't work. So it has to take you along a track. You know, as they say, if everything that doesn't kill you teaches you something.
That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Makes you stronger. But according to Cheating the Ferryman, my hypothesis, even things that kill you make you stronger because it makes the Daemon stronger. Yeah. I never thought about that before, so thank you for that, Ty. I'd never thought about it before, but it does. Even your death makes you stronger because next time your Daemon knows and it won't get you to that position where you were killed. It will try its damnedest.
Try not to if you're perceptive about what's happening around you.
If your doors of perception are sufficiently open that you listen for the inklings, you listen for the subliminal messages that it gives you. Yeah. And it will, and it will try its damnedest. But as Socrates' Daemon did, it gave up. And we cited before we went live about Joan of Arc. Right. Joan of Arc's Daemon was with her all the time, her voices, until when she escaped, she chose Well, there was one time where she had voices told her not to try and escape, and she jumped from a battlement and she broke her leg and she got caught. And the entities left her. They weren't there with her at the trial, and she didn't know why. And they were not there because they knew that she'd made the mistake that she made last time, and there was nothing they could do. So they wanted just to go back to the start. I wrote a play on Joan of Arc called The Voices a few years ago, which has never been performed, but I deal with that aspect of exactly why the daemon works, how it functions, and how it gets pissed off. But also, I have a concept called the cacodemon, which means the daemons aren't necessarily good guys. They're looking after you, which means they may do evil things. I mean, I give the example of the Stauffenberg plot with Adolf Hitler, where Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb next to Hitler in a conference. I don't know if you know the story, but the bomb was there and would have killed Hitler. Hitler got up and his leg kicked it behind a barrier, which saved Hitler's life. That was his daemon. But that meant that thousands, hundreds of thousands or more people died in the Second World War. So the daemon wasn't looking after fellow human beings. It was making sure that its eidolon survived.
Yeah.
And that's important. We don't necessarily believe the eidolon is good, the daemon is good.
Yeah, and it's so powerful that you're speaking about that, because I believe in positive energy and negative energy, and I believe I only will work with energy that is positive, because I believe that the whole process of creativity can be very negative as well. It can be destructive just as much. No one's determining whether it's a positive or negative thing except the person who's doing the actual creation itself. So you don't want to.
There is no arbiter. This is the thing. That there's the assumption that there's some form of arbiter who's saying, well, you shouldn't succeed in life. But we know through life that the evil people usually succeed.
Yeah.
The psychopaths normally succeed because they have no empathy with fellow human beings.
Highly creative at what they do.
Yeah. And I know, and probably you do, having functioned at the highest level in various industries over the years, I met these psychopaths regularly. They were nearly always CEOs, and they were just ruthless completely. Yeah. They would just look after themselves and their own interests, and those people succeed.
And here's where we are today.
Exactly. Without saying any more than that, yeah.
So I have one more question for you, if I can, and it's about...
Yeah, fine. I'll need to go in about 10 or 15 minutes.
But... Okay, no worries, because so do I. The author's name is Ingo Swann.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
Ingo Swann, I wrote, again, on my book on out-of-body experiences. I had a whole section on Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann intrigues me.
He does.
In that I think a lot of him was a charlatan. I have pointed out that when he did his research at the Pearl Laboratories, and he was isolating using longitude and latitude grids as to what was located at certain places, I pointed out that anybody with even a basic knowledge of geography, if they're given specific coordinates, will know where on the planet they are. Like, for instance, there was one famous case where he identified Kerguelen, the island of Kerguelen, which is a French dependency in the southern Atlantic. Now, if I was given those particular coordinates, I would know from my knowledge of geography that the area I'm looking at is somewhere in the southern Atlantic. I would also know from my knowledge of geography that there are probably 4 different islands down there at different locations. All of them have bases from different countries. So they're bound to have the things he described on there. So that didn't impress me that much. But there were other things that did interest me. Like, for instance, his prediction of the discovery of the rings of Jupiter. I don't know if you know about that one?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you listen to what he actually described, it doesn't make sense. He described that he saw the rings coming out of the planet, not going round the planet. But more importantly, he claimed he saw volcanoes on the surface of Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is a gas giant. There are no volcanoes on Jupiter. Even if there was a solid core, which there may be, The volcanoes would have to have been ridiculously high to be poking out of the cloud cover that Jupiter has. But he claimed he saw these things. I then pointed out in my book, and I think, again, I'm the only writer to do this. I pointed out Ingo Swann wasn't seeing Jupiter. He was seeing Io, which is one of Jupiter's moons. And it's the most volcanic moon in the solar system. It is covered in volcanoes. Now, Ingo Swann wouldn't have known that. So I think what's taking place when people have out-of-body experiences, what I argue is they are, again, like what I said about the egregorial and co-creating reality. When they go out of the body, they are creating that reality that they're within through the information they know about. And it doesn't mean it's not any more real than this is, because this is a collapsed wave function. They're just doing the same, and it's what they anticipate. For instance, I give the example of, who was it? Robert Monroe. You know, the out-of-body guy?
No, I'm not familiar.
Okay, Robert Monroe was the guy that started the whole OBE thing. He wrote a book called Travels Out of the Body. And he was, again, a business executive who started having OBEs and was so intrigued. He set up this thing called the Monroe Institute, which trained people in this, still exists now. And Charles Tart, who is a famous parapsychologist, wanted to test Robert about his ability to get out of his body. And what he did was, he said, Tart told him and said, I'm moving to a new house in California. The Monroe Institute is in Virginia, moving to California. And he said, if you can get out your body and visualize the layout of my new house, phone me and let me know what you've seen. And Tart was in his new house for a period of time, and Barbara Monroe rings him and said, yes, I saw you in your living room. I had an out-of-body experience last night and I saw you. The fascinating thing was, there were things that Monroe described that which were absolutely 100% accurate, who was in the room, what they were talking about. But the furniture was wrong, the colour of the curtains was wrong, there were lots of other things that were wrong. Now, again, I think what is happening here is what researchers call the intrasomatic and the extrasomatic. The intrasomatic is the inner world that we create and expand outwards. And I think what is happening with out-of-body experiences is they are out of their body, but they're creating out of their expectations a reality as well. And they mix the two together because they can't control them. I know of nobody, and there might be people out there, and I'd love to meet them. I mean, there's associates of mine that claim they can do it, but I've never seen them be able to do it, that can get out of their body instantaneously and just go somewhere. Because as I've argued, what are you seeing? You're not seeing with photons. You're not seeing with your retina because you're out of your body. You're not hearing with the drum in the brain. So whatever you're hearing, it's psychic. It's created in a different way to this reality. Now, again, a really good friend of mine that you must have on the show when her new book comes out is a young lady called Samantha Lee Treasure. She's got a new book. I've written the foreword for it. She's going to blow the lid off the whole out-of-body experience stuff. She's an anthropologist who has OBEs.
Yeah, I saw you mention her on, I believe it was Facebook.
Good. Check her out. Her book is extraordinary. And it's, again, the idea, and she and I both agree with the model, you know, that, and Graham as well, somebody else you need, Graham as well also argues this, that we're sort of co-creating it. And Ingo Swann, some of the things he described were accurate. You know, the way he described the nuclear reactor, the part of the nuclear reactor, was it a nuclear? It was something that he managed. So to me, some people have this skill, this ability, but they're not traveling in this. They're not traveling in what I call consensual. Well, it's not what I call consensual reality. Consensual reality is the co-created reality we all exist within. But there's this other reality, and because I work closely with people who have OBEs, this is an area we're really wanting to work on. You know, so Graham Nichols, for instance, as a final, I'll point this will blow your mind. And if you get Graham Nichols on your show, Graham is the real deal out-of-body experiencer. Graham Nichols had a precognitive out-of-body experience, which was verified.
Cognitive.
Okay? He was training people. He's an artist as well, and he was training. I'm not sure if he was training people on OBEs or out-of-body or art. I'm not sure, but he was on the stage in 1999, November 1999, I think it was, and he's on stage, and he's taught, and he suddenly feels his knees buckle, and his legs give way, and he comes to, loses consciousness, and he comes to, and he's in a jungle, and he can feel the heat around him, he can hear the cicadas. And the dampness around him, and he's surrounded by tall plants. He said he then walks through the plants, spread them apart, stands outside, and he's standing on the corner of Old Compton Street and Wardour Street in Soho in London. And he's standing there, and he said, I was there. And he said a kid ran past him, and he felt the displacement of the air as the kid ran past. And he looks down the street, and as he looks down the street, there's a huge explosion. And as it's taking place, it was even more important. As it's taking place, he can hear people going, Graham, are you okay? And it's people in the lecture theatre trying to bring him to. He hears these voices above him, and he ignores them. Looks down the street, sees an explosion. People coming out covered in blood, screams, everything else. And then suddenly he finds himself rising up, and he comes to, surrounded by 4 or 5 people. He turns around and said, I think I've just seen there's going to be a bomb explosion in Soho soon, and he described the location. 5 days later, there was a nail bomb in a gay bar called the Admiral Duncan in exactly the location Graham said. He has 5 witnesses to this. The only answer is either Graham is telling the truth and the witnesses are telling the truth, or they're all lying. Now that to me, and Graham approached me because my book on out-of-body experiences, I said, you're not out of your body. You're confabulating an internal reality. And Graham said, no, I've had experiences that I know I'm out of my body. But what is even more interesting here is that Graham argues he knows when his out-of-body experiences are precognitive. He calls it the cerulean effect, because everything is tinged in slight blue. So when everything around him is slightly blue in colour, he knows it's a precognitive experience. Now this is the exciting stuff that me and my associates are doing. You know, it really is groundbreaking, really groundbreaking. We've got some very interesting things here. I've just written the foreword for Graham's new book. Graham has reissued his first book, and I've written the foreword for that. So I've written the foreword for Sam Manthily Treasure's book and Graham's book. Get them on board. And Sam is the future. Sam is going to be huge. Once she gets out there, once people see her, see how she speaks, she's Canadian. And she has just got this magical quality.
Gotcha.
She is worth talking to.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you. I truly appreciate your time. Like I said, I've been thinking about your work for quite a while, and it's really helped to develop mine out as well. You know, so
I am deeply honoured by that. I'm genuinely honoured.
No, thank you. And I'd love for an opportunity to be able to perhaps connect with you in the future, and maybe even
totally. I think we've got a lot of synergy here, and I think the idea of the business orientation. I think we might have something there.
Yeah, I'd love to connect with you on it and see, because you're looking inward, and I love the aspect of looking inward, because that's not my intelligence. I'm not as good with the interpersonal relationships. The outer side, the experiences outside, that's my space. So I'd love to connect with you further on that one.
Let's do that. Let's just have a general Zoom chat.
Sounds good.
Okay, Ty, thank you very much. Wonderful to talk to you.
Time today.
Okay. And let me know when it's up, and I'll get it up on all my social media.
I will, and I'll let you know how I'm going to do it as well, how I'm going to spread the actual information and feed it out slowly.
Okay, sounds good. Okay then.
Cheers.
Okay, bye. Yeah, bye. Thank you.
Bye.
That's all for this episode of Think Different Nation, a Steve Jobs playbook. Your host, Ty Glover, thanks you for listening to the show and exploring the process of connecting the dots to create groundbreaking ideas. Stay curious, keep trusting in that something, and tune in next time for more insights that help us think differently. Before you head out, visit thinkdifferentnation.com to discover more about the neuroscience behind innovation, along with tactics and tools to supercharge your mindset to becoming more innovative. Are you ready to shift your thought processes to trust more in your gut instincts, destiny, life experiences, karma, or whatever else you want to call it? Then come and learn the true process of Think Differently so you can connect more dots and build truly groundbreaking ideas.